Hello, thank you, Mr. Nugent, for meeting.
Thank you for inviting me.
Mr. Nugent, თუ შეიძლება გითხარით თქვენი აქტიური ჟურნალისტობის პერიოდში რომელი სააგენტოებისთვის მუშაობდით?
Yes, I worked for the BBC World Service for 25 years. And always I was associated with Asia. So I used to report from countries from Iran, from India, from Vietnam, and many other countries. And that's what I really enjoyed, being at the front line and reporting elections, conflicts, life, everything. And then in my senior time at the BBC, I became responsible for correspondence abroad. And it was my job to send them to these places if we didn't have coverage there already. For example, I used to say, my job is to anticipate next week's news, get the correspondent there, possibly get the camera there, so that we were ready. And as I've been telling you, if I were still in my old job, I would have beefed up our coverage from Tbilisi in recent times, because it seems to me this is a very important story. But I'm not in my old job, so I'm a listener and an observer of what they do, rather than one who is directing how we do the news coverage.
Mr. Nugent, თუ შეიძლება მითხარით, საქართველოში რა მისიით იყავით ჩამოსული და ჟურნალისტურ საქმიანობას ვის ასწავლიდით, რომელ ტელეპროგრამებს ეხმარებოდით?
Well, after I left the BBC, I became a freelance, both continuing to do journalism, but mostly then teaching journalism, journalism in general and journalism of radio and television in particular. That took me to many parts of the world, including Georgia. And I was very pleased to be given assignments in Georgia, which included, my first assignment there was to work with the public broadcaster to try to introduce the standards that the BBC follows. BBC is Britain's public broadcaster, very well respected, and has very high standards. Standards, for example, of accuracy, of not taking sides, being absolutely impartial in any story. When in television's case, of having the best pictures available to them, which usually means having your own camera operator, if the story deserves it. So my role at public broadcaster in Georgia was exactly that, to try to encourage them to set the highest standard of broadcasting, not to take sides, not to be a government agency, but to be an impartial coverage, an expert at covering news. I only know about news, I don't know about other programs on television. And later I worked for Maestro TV for a bit as well. The same requirement, to be the impartial deliverer of news. And I did a number of other jobs in Georgia, but Georgia has left a very special place in my heart because, well, I spent a lot of time there. And it's, if I may put it like that, it's an exciting country, but it's also a very important country in a European context because, well, because of your history, your recent history, your split from the Soviet Union, your development as an independent country, including the media, and indeed your geographical position in the Caucasus between East and West. So for all these reasons, Georgia seems to me a very important country.
თქვენ დღესაც თვალს ადევნებთ საქართველოში მიმდინარე მოვლენებს და ჟურნალისტურ საქმიანობას.
Well, as I've already indicated, my style of journalism is never to take sides. I think the campaigning journalist is not a journalist. So I'm not in the position to talk about what the rights and wrongs of what is happening in Georgia today. And ideally, I would prefer that journalists were not taking sides in Georgia. But I have to be realistic. And Georgians, whether they're journalists or not, have strong political opinions. And I can see that a lot of people are very angry with the government. or Parliament in general for the direction they seem to be taking. As an outside observer, I would only say this. I think Georgia is at the fault line between East and West, or in the European context, between autocracy and democracy, or to be blunt about it, between Russia and the European Union. All those things apply. This is why if I were in my old job, I would be beefing up the coverage of Georgia, because it matters not just for Georgia, it matters for Europe. And at this crucial stage in European affairs, with Russia having invaded a sovereign state, because that's what's happened, we in the West of Europe, I put myself in that category, we in the West of Europe need to be concerned, possibly more than concerned, and here I'm expressing an opinion that I wouldn't normally broadcast on air, but I think we in the West of Europe, we owe some responsibility to countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus eventually, because these are new countries. These are new countries, and they have everything to play for. And it does seem that at the moment we have two camps in Europe, and I've already identified them. One is Russia and Russian-influenced countries like Belarus, and the other is free democracies, most of whom belong to the European Union, but not all. And indeed, as you know, Britain has left the European Union, but we can still regard ourselves as a free Western democracy concerned for our own security. And should the conflict in Ukraine spread, we in Britain would be just as concerned as the European Union would be about any transition. So again, that's why I am troubled by this. I mean, we know our present global trouble spots are, number one, Ukraine. Number two, perhaps, if we go to Asia, is the Taiwan situation. The tension is there. And my worry is that Georgia becomes a third global trouble spot, because we're seeing it. We're seeing it today. We're seeing how Russian influence is challenging Western leaning, or shall we say freedom? Shall we just call it freedom? I'm not so concerned about whether Georgia joins the European Union or not. It's just that European Union seems to hold the mantle for democratic nations of Europe, or democracy in Europe. So it is a logical place for countries like Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, and possibly the other ones I mentioned, to join European Union. And the fact that Britain has come out, you wonder why Britain's come out. Is it because the European Union has failed it? No, it's British politics, I'm afraid. We have, I call them little Englanders, people who think we are better off on our own outside the European Union. I happen not to agree with them. I think there's strength in unity, and I voted for Britain to remain in the European Union. European Union is a good thing, though sometimes we can quarrel with what it does. I'm a supporter of the European Union. By the way, I've worked for the European Union, including in Georgia. So, but I'm not telling you, Georgians, which side to lean. If you think Georgia's future is in Russia or following Russian instincts, then that's not something I'm going to have an opinion on. But it seems to me that most Georgians lean in the different direction towards freedom, democracy, and ultimately integration within the European Union. But remember, I'm a journalist. I'm not taking sides. I'm only trying to describe the events as I see them and to reflect on the significance and indeed the importance for Europe as a whole on what is happening in Georgia at the moment.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mamuka.